So I wanted to thank everybody for joining today. My name is Josina Morita. I'm a commissioner at the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District and chair of the Asian American Caucus. I want to thank AAPIP and Forefront and our other partners for helping us host this discussion today. We wanted to have this discussion for a few reasons. First, we've been getting a lot of, as the caucus, and I think a lot of our Asian American organizational partners have been getting a lot of inquiries over the last few months in particular, but the last year in general, particularly from nonprofit and philanthropic leaders about how to understand and advocate for Asian Americans. We want to be able to provide some frameworks and some language and some tools for you all to be able to do that. Secondly, and just to be frank, I think some of us have also had conversations with leaders about the need to include Asian Americans in racial equity work, and have gotten some pushback, if not some confusion, about why Asian Americans should be included. And we want to provide a framework about why and how Asian Americans should be included in racial justice work, especially here in Chicago and especially right now. And that leads to the third point of just the urgency of now. We're living in a moment where I think a lot of people can recognize, that Asian Americans are experiencing racism and anti-Asian hate. And we're living in a moment where if we kind of fail to meet this moment, to recognize and understand Asian Americans for who we are, our diversity, our challenges, our struggles, and our contributions, and to really find a way to work together to advance racial equity in a way that's really inclusive and representative of the disparities and lived experiences of our communities, then we're kind of failing this moment. And so there's a real urgency of now. And for me as the chair of the Asian American Caucus, and for all of our members in the Asian American Caucus, we recognize our responsibility to use our platform to help educate and address these issues. It's not lost on us as a caucus that just 5 years ago, we're now 9 members strong, but just 5 years ago, none of us were elected. In the last decade, we've gone from 0 to 5 in the General Assembly. I'm the first Asian American elected countywide. So we really have not been at the table in a lot of policy discussions. And especially at this moment, as we look at anti-Asian hate, our progress is palpable, but we also recognize how important it is for us to use our platform to educate and engage. So we thank everybody for partnering with us today to have this discussion. I'll start with a really brief overview of Asian American history, and I hope nobody is offended by how brief it is. I just wanted to be able to provide a kind of structural context to understand Asian American history, and that'll lead into a more in-depth conversation with Brandon Lee, who helped author the UIC report on Asian Americans, who will go over Asian American demographics and data, how to understand it, how to disaggregate it, how to dissect it. And then we'll go to Grace Pye from Asian Americans Advancing Justice, who will talk about how to organize around Asian Americans in a racial equity framework, what some specific lessons and strategies and examples are, especially here in Chicago. But I did want to provide this kind of history context briefly, just because I think that sometimes, talking to people, there is this overall sentiment that anti-Asian violence, anti-Asian racism is, one, I think, less urgent, less violent, or less egregious than other forms of racism. I also think that sometimes there's a sense that this is new, like, the Atlanta shootings happen, and all of a sudden people are realizing that anti-Asian violence can look like that. But I think people oftentimes are not understanding that this is part of a much broader, longer history of Asian Americans in this country. So I'm 6th generation Chinese American, 5th generation Japanese American. So my family has literally lived through the Chinese Exclusion Act and Japanese American internment, and attacks on Asian Americans that we've seen recently. So this is not new for a lot of us as Asian Americans, but to provide a little bit of a just overview structure to understand Asian American history, because it is incredibly diverse by country of origin. It's incredibly diverse by the push and pull factors. there's also incredibly diverse in terms of what kind of people have come to this country in these different waves of migration. So Asian American migration, started in the 1850s. My family actually came in 1859 as laborers to work in the coal mines, to work on the railroads. Actually built the transcontinental railroad in this country, and so up from the 1850s all the way up until 1965. It was primarily laborers, working class immigrants who were coming from different, largely East Asian and South Asian countries to work as laborers, to work as cheap labor. They were literally recruited by the US government. Some may have heard of, Chinese were recruited to come to what they call Gold Mountain, right? There's all this money and all these riches here, and they were recruited here and then were kind of tricked into indentured servitude and labor. But from the first wave, from the 1860s all the way up until 1965, it was largely working class migrants that were coming here, oftentimes single men who would later then try to bring their families along with them. But in 1965, with the Immigration and Nationality Act, there became a much more intentional recruitment of Asian professionals from different Asian countries. So we talk about brain drain, but a lot of people who came post 1965, right, are coming with PhDs, coming with medical degrees, coming from families with more access and wealth. And so, people who came post 1965 is a very different set of people who then necessarily came before 1965. Both in terms of ethnic country of origin, but also in terms of education and class background. And I think the other thing to highlight, that not all of it's necessarily here in this timeline, is that every time that there was kind of economic competition with Asian countries, that you saw a rise in anti-Asian violence domestically, right? So it was, not just other Asian countries, but with Asian Americans in this country as well. So it was competition between white farmers and Japanese farmers that were the impetus of the internment camps. It actually wasn't the war itself. All of the documents show that it was actually the economic competition between white and Japanese farmers, not the actual war with Japan. In the 1980s, when there was a lot of competition in the Japanese auto market, that's when we saw the murder of Vincent Chin. And then, of course, more recently, a lot of the kind of scapegoating of China and, the China virus from our former president and things like that. Now we've seen a rise in anti-Asian violence again. So this is not new. This is part of a much broader context of history and also a much broader pattern of scapegoating of Asians and Asian Americans that have led to increases in anti-Asian violence in this country. So hopefully that provides at least a broader framework as we go into a more current situation and go into more deeper data analysis. So I'll hand it over to Brandon to talk a little bit more about Asian American demographics and data.
I was muted. I'm sorry. Thank you, Josina. Thank you for having me today. I just shared my screen and I'm gonna pull up my notes, but I lost my screen. 1 second here. I'm sorry. The notes and the screen were not cooperating. 1 second here. While I bring this back up, I just want to say thank you to Josina for having us today, and to AAPIP and everybody who helped to organize this. I'm sorry, this seemed like a good idea to do it this way, and now I am having trouble. But I
Brandon,
will have
do you want me to do the screen share for you?
Grace, I can get it up in 1 second here. I'm sorry. You know, I'm sorry. Usually I'm on top of this.
No worries. We all know the Zoom struggle.
You know, the worst part is that it was ready. I had everything ready, and then I also needed this other tab. Here we go. That'll do it. Anyway, I'll just get started, and then once my computer loads, I will share it. Hey, everybody. So my name is Brandon Lee, and I'm the communications director at the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant Refugee Rights, and I'm also a member of the Asian Giving Circle. In a previous professional life, I also worked at Asian Americans Advancing Justice in a number of roles over the course of 6.5 non-consecutive years. But my time with Advancing Justice actually started with the largest data collection effort in the United States, which is the decennial census. And we just wrapped up the 2020 decennial census, but my first role with Advancing Justice was as part of the outreach team for the 2010 census as an AmeriCorps Vista member. So one of my jobs was to conduct community outreach, make sure community members from across Chicago and across Illinois participated in the census. And also, it was a time where Asian American leaders and Asian American organizations were coming together for a collective goal, which was to get a complete count of our communities in Illinois. And the truth is, the 2010 census is really was the cornerstone for a lot of data related to Asian Americans over the last decade. So my screen just came back here. I will present, and I will screen share. Okay, great. So flash forward a couple of years from the 2010 census, and we're able to see that not only was the census a jumping off point for our collective work, but also that data plays a central role in our organizing campaigns. We're able to, as Advancing Justice and as a coalition of it's called the Pan-Asian Voter Empowerment Coalition, which still exists today. As the Pan-Asian Voter Empowerment Coalition, we're able to successfully advocate for a state appropriation for hepatitis B services because we're able to show a disparity among Asian Americans using data collected by the census, collected by some of our partner organizations, and collected by other national research organizations. So we're able to rally our community members to come out and support it, to rally organizations to also throw their weight behind it, and rally members of the Illinois General Assembly, particularly those who have high populations of Asian Americans in their district. There were many, many factors going in that contributed to that win. And one of them is that good data collection is key for our work as advocates and organizers. It helps us to tell the story of our community and relate to policymakers and legislators in such a way that we can get what our communities need. These are some photos from a past Asian American Action Day in Springfield, which is coming up on Tuesday, by the way, virtual style, for those of you who are interested in it. But I picked this slide in part because one of the signs that we made really focuses on some of the data related to Asian Americans and some of the disparities that we see across the community. So while Grace is going to go into a little bit more on the model minority myth, you still see the 1 in 5 Asian American youth live in poverty, a quarter of Korean American seniors live in poverty, 20% of Chinese seniors live in poverty. You're still seeing these gaps by both ethnicity and by age. But what you're really seeing also is this incredible growth in the Asian American community over the course of decades. Josina referenced some of the factors for that growth in terms of opening of legislation in the 1960s, and then growth in the community has continued today to the point where Asian Americans have been, if not the fastest growing community, depending on how you slice it geographically, certainly one of the fastest growing communities geographically. In some states, you are seeing Asian American population growth outpacing overall population growth. So you're seeing that in Illinois, where the Asian American population increased at a faster rate than the overall population. This data is from Pew Research. For all of these, I'll drop them into the chat, and I'll make sure it gets around to participants, to attendees as well. This is a display of growth regionally. So you're not only seeing growth in Illinois, you're also seeing growth in Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, Wisconsin. Really across the Midwest, Asian American communities are growing. This is the growth between 2000 and 2010. Once those 2020 numbers come out, we'll start to see whether that growth continued across the board regionally. And then this is a table pulled from API data, and I'll make sure that link gets into the comments as well. But this is showing that Asian populations are growing not only in the city of Chicago, but they're growing, and they have our communities have sizable populations outside of the city as well. You see DuPage County, Lake County, Champaign County, all with higher percentages of Asian Americans than Cook on this list. And this is to provide some perspective. Chicago has the largest Asian American population among cities in the Midwest at over 160,000. And that Chicago is the home to the 7th largest Asian American population in the United States. So in terms of Asian American presence in Chicago and in the Midwest, Chicago ranks up there nationally. All this data, right? But it doesn't tell the full story. A couple of years ago, I contributed to a report from the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy at the University of Illinois, Chicago, which is my alma mater. I will make sure I'll make sure the link makes it in the comments. But their main takeaways from the report were that Asian Americans are a very diverse population within the umbrella category of Asian American. You'll see disparities across racial groups, and you'll see that discrimination still plays a part in the Asian American experience in Chicago and beyond. So one of the clearest ways to kind of show this is this disparity in household income. This is also from the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy report, where you see how, yes, there are some Asian American groups that are on par with or exceeding household income for white households. You're also seeing other groups that lag significantly behind, where you're seeing Vietnamese, Korean, Pakistani, Cambodian, Bangladeshi, Thai communities coming in significantly lower than white households in Chicago in terms of median income. You're also seeing this is from a past Asian Americans Advancing Justice report. I'll make sure this also gets in the comments. You're also seeing this disparity in educational attainment, where yes, some Asian American groups are outpacing the total population, or outpacing the white population, you're still seeing some disparities within Asian American. So, and again, Asian Americans in terms of housing in Chicago, moderately segregated from whites, highly segregated from Black and Latinx populations. Asian Americans are held to a higher standard and have lower approval rates for home loans. So this is, these are some of the ways that that discrimination still, is still showing up. So that's in addition to the diversity, showing the diversity within the community and showing this really sort of wide distribution within the Asian American community between those who have been able to attain attain education, those who have been able to purchase house, and those who haven't. I do want to give a quick shout out to the Community of Contrast report by Asian Americans Advancing Justice. It's from 2012, but a lot of the data is still, really, a lot of the data is still informative and can signal to trends in terms of what we could be seeing in the decade to come. And I also want to give a shout out to AAPI data, which is also a great resource for data on Asian Americans. That's where I pulled the county by county table. But big takeaways again are the diversity within the community, the disparities among communities within the community, and that Asian Americans still face discrimination. You're seeing that with the housing slide. You're also seeing that with the rise in violence against Asian Americans. I will hop in the chat. I saw a couple of comments there, so I will hop in there. But I'll throw it to Grace, and then I think we'll have some time for a Q&A as well.
Thanks so much, Brandon. I'll just dive in. I think let me introduce myself. My name is Grace Pye. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Director of Organizing at Advancing Justice Chicago and have had the great pleasure of working with Brandon and Josina in many different contexts. So I want to just continue on the thread that Brandon shared kind of about the disparity within our community, but also, just why these ideas like Asians as a model minority exist. So there's this very pervasive myth, and just to break down, how has it come into existence, right? Why are Asian Americans broadly painted with this brush and kind of viewed in this way? And so throughout history, as Josina kind of outlined at the outset, our immigration law has prioritized its labor needs, both in the form of cheap exploitable labor, such as in the case of the Chinese immigrant railroad workers, or skilled, educated immigrants from Asia. Kind of post-1965, we've seen this real kind of prioritization of highly skilled, highly educated immigrants. Excuse me. And then I think in the context of that, we also see waves of refugees coming from Asia, which I think really creates and kind of provides that context for some of the disparities that Brandon has highlighted, and the differences in experiences, right, in life experiences, in socioeconomic status, in education status and attainment within our community. And so when you think about, the US as a kind of through our immigration system prioritizing certain people, it creates this sense of, I think, of understanding of why we see some of the disparities that we see within the community and why these stereotypes have persisted, right? If you think of it as the US only let in people with, significant resources, high levels of education, particular technical skills, then it's kind of easier to understand why there are stereotypes like, Asians being smart or high achieving. And when you think of it as an exclusionary policy, that those are the only immigrants that we let in for a period of time, I think it offers more context for how, structures and systems have created some of the, anecdotes, the things that people feel like they see that validate, these stereotypes and sort of narratives about Asian Americans, broadly speaking. The actual term model minority did not exist until 1966, when it was coined by a sociologist to undermine the civil rights movement. And so sometimes Asian Americans are talked about as a wedge. And that's how white supremacy has used our community to divide other communities of color. So by lifting up a quote unquote good minority, right, it draws contrast to a quote unquote bad minority. And in a lot of cases, but in the 60s in particular, Asian Americans were lifted up to contrast from the Black community's demands for civil rights and to say, oh, here's a good minority, why is this other minority demanding civil rights? And so I think that context, that history is really important to remember, because it was used by white supremacy as a structure by like white politicians and sociologists to divide communities of color from each other and to hide the reasons why those communities should have solidarity and why those communities have shared interests. So there are just a couple of examples on the slide of particular media stories that really lifted up Asian Americans in this very particular light as this quote unquote model minority that, when you're looking back at it and you see these stories, you see, the way that these sociologists were talking about this racial group of Asian Americans, in retrospect, it's easier to see like, oh, we were being used, right? Like we were being used, this was not something that Asian Americans coined and put out there, although many in our community have embraced that myth. I think that that is an important reality to note, that it's not that, all Asian Americans are out here decrying the model minority myth. Unfortunately, we have seen many people buy into it, right? And try to use that as a way of, accomplishing more or succeeding. But, the roots of it are very harmful and were used to sow division and to prevent cross-racial solidarity. The other piece, I think, that is really helpful in breaking down the model minority myth really gets back to what Brandon was saying. And Asian Americans are the most economically divided racial group in the US. The gap between the wealthiest Asian Americans and the poorest Asian Americans is the widest of any racial group. If you ask any person on the street, they would not guess this. They would not think that this is true based on the way that they have been trained to believe in this myth of the model minority. And this erases so many of the struggles and experiences of members of our community, particularly the folks who are at the margins, right? Folks who are undocumented, folks who came as refugees, folks who are low income. There's just, I think this erasure of that experience that, oh, Asian Americans aren't experiencing that, right? This kind of perception, and that prevents Asian Americans from, being considered as beneficiaries of important programs, right? Things like increasing access to, education resources. People don't think that Asian Americans need more access to education resources because there is this perception of our community in a particular way, right? And I think that it's important to really center the experiences of those who are most marginalized within the AAPI community, in order to guide the kinds of policies, the kinds of systematic change that we are all fighting for. And so the next slide just shows a graph of this Pew Research study on economic inequality within racial groups. And you can see that economic inequality within the Asian American community grew significantly from 1970 to 2016. And when you think about, some of the history that Josina outlined and the immigration policies, particularly in the 90s, that really, exclusively, solely let in or prioritized, I should say, highly educated, highly skilled immigrants, it kind of makes a little bit more sense why we saw such a stark rise in that time period. And then lastly, I want to highlight some solidarity and racial equity fights to talk about the stake of Asian Americans in broader racial equity fights. So of course, Asian Americans there are many, many immigrants, right, in the Asian American community, people who have more recently immigrated or are directly the child of immigrants. And so there are also many undocumented folks in the Asian American community that also are sort of invisibilized in the broad narrative around immigration reform or access to citizenship. And so, Advancing Justice Chicago has been a big part of efforts to change those systems and to create more protections for undocumented folks and to gain more access to resources, largely through our partnership with the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. The Illinois Trust Act in 2017 was a landmark piece of legislation that limited collaboration between local law enforcement and federal immigration enforcement, or ICE. And we have had many, many pieces of follow-up legislation since the Trust Act in 2017 to build on that win. We weren't able to accomplish everything, but we were able to, in pieces of legislation like the Voices Act, like Keeping Immigrant Families Together Act, to build on that and to find ways to continue to support our undocumented community members and immigrant community members who have had many negative experiences with law enforcement and face greater penalties when they do come into contact with the criminal legal system. I also wanted to kind of come back to a case from 2013 of a Chinese American woman in Chicago, Jessica Klychek, who was the victim of police brutality when her tanning salon was raided in Westtown. And there were 3 police officers involved who just physically assaulted her, threw racial slurs at her, threatened her with deportation. And, just the news of that in 2014 really sparked outrage in the Asian American community. And the organizing around that particular incident is important. And I want to highlight, the community organizations that came together to, organize town halls and to call for accountability for those officers and the firing of those officers, and really, the advocacy that happened. But I also want to focus just as much on what happened after that for many Asian Americans, at least, Advancing Justice, like we took this as an opportunity to continue a longer term fight, both against police brutality and police misconduct, and the consequences of local law enforcement being able to send, immigrants into the deportation pipeline. And so there are 2 pieces that I think really came out of that for Advancing Justice. One is we started a police accountability working group that still exists today after in 2016, like largely informed by these experiences that we had had in organizing. And we started working with other immigrant organizations and largely like Latinx organizations to fight to end the carve-outs in the Chicago Welcoming City Ordinance. So I'm going a little bit in mixed order here, but the Welcoming City Ordinance, the amendments to eliminate the carve-outs, which previously allowed local law enforcement, police officers to communicate with federal immigration enforcement if there was like an outstanding warrant or a pending felony charge on an individual, those were closed this year in February 2021 after 5 years of advocacy. And we joined that fight, in the kind of aftermath of the Jessica Klychek case. And so in this moment of anti-Asian racism, right, the rise that we've seen and the incredible violent acts that people have been victims to, yes, it's important to do something about that now, but it's also important to stay involved, right, years from now in structural fights to end the influence of white supremacy in so many of these structures that negatively harm community members and often are disproportionately leveraged against other communities of color that are not necessarily the Asian American community, right? That there's this opportunity when Asian Americans are kind of the focus, and when we are facing this increased level of violence, to also make sure that, you know, we are in the fight for the long haul, that we are advocating to make sure that systems that, you know, much more often target Black and Latinx folks, that we're in that fight, you know, for years to come. And so I want to lastly just quickly highlight the Pretrial Fairness Act, which ended cash bail in Illinois, which Advancing Justice was a part of that coalition because of the police accountability work that started, again, in the aftermath of the Jessica Kleinschek case. And so, you know, we know that the vast majority of individuals who will be impacted by ending cash bail in a positive way are Black, they're not Asian, right? But there are ways that Asian Americans are impacted, but that is not the focus, and it shouldn't be the focus. And we can have our solidarity work be rooted in, you know, the experiences of Asian Americans, to bring that perspective in without it being, you know, the kind of main focus. And I think we've seen many, many examples in, you know, Chicago local organizing of groups coming together across racial lines to really fight for the structural changes that we need. And that is the kind of piece that I hold on to, you know, in the most depressing of days. Like, we've just experienced such an onslaught of really horrible news. And, you know, we've all been isolated from each other for this whole year. And I think that there is, you know, a deep level of potential for us to continue the important work of solidarity and racial equity fights. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Brandon and Grace. Hopefully folks found that useful as a start to the conversation. We're going to open it up to questions that folks have for any of us or for each other. So we'll go ahead and open it up. Let me, you can either raise your hand or send something in the chat or speak up. Unmute.
Hi everyone. Nice to see you all. And thanks so much for putting this program together. Such an important topic. Brandon, it's been a couple years since I saw the UIC report, but I remember that there were two things that really stood out for me that were surprises for me, which was one that, you know, even though we think that, you know, in spite of the bifurcation of incomes across the Asian American population, I think I didn't realize that we continue to be discriminated against for interest rates, for, you know, in the banking sector, and that even though it looks like Asian Americans are achieving in high rates in professional employment, we are still discriminated against in that when you compare by education level and employment status, we are still earning less than whites, and we have to have higher levels of education in order to qualify for the same positions. And I just thought that was a really important finding that came out from the report.
Yeah, definitely. And I just dropped the link in the chat. I would encourage everybody to give it a look and download not only that series, not only that issue, they also did one on state of racial justice for American Indians in Chicago, for Native folks in Chicago, and also they have one in the works for Arab Americans in Chicago. It's a great series. I would recommend checking out all of them, and also the original report broke down white, Black, Latinx disparities in Chicago. So check out the series. I think the Asian American one, like you said, Unmi, is definitely like, you know, it gives us a lot to chew on as Asian Americans, and and also as people who are advocating for Asian Americans in our respective fields.
Hi, this is David from Poitec Center. Recently I've been having very frustrating discussions with around COVID vaccination. So because Asians have had experience with SARS and other pandemics, they're pretty quick to mask up and follow social distancing. That put us very low in the city of Chicago's COVID vulnerability index. So that vaccinations weren't going into communities that Asians tend to live in Chicago. So like Armour Square is in the low vulnerability group. Most of the north side communities where Asians live are also in the low vulnerability group. That means that even if it was very challenging for groups to get pop-up events in their communities. And now there's some grant funding to try to convince the hesitant. And so because we're in the low vulnerability groups areas, probably none of the funding is going to go to Asian American groups. And so it was probably this wide disparity between highly educated, high socioeconomic status and people with minority languages kind of living in contributing to kind of lower cases of COVID. That's been a frustration that we've faced just recently.
I can kind of take that maybe from a broader perspective, and Grace, maybe you want to address some of the specifics. I mean, this is just a challenge that we've had also as elected officials, right? When we talk about Asian Americans, we're low on the totem pole of priority for, one, we're a small portion of the population, right? So we're never a majority anywhere. People have these misperceptions within that 7% that we make up of the state of who exactly we are and where, if there is need, and if so, where it is. We also have the challenges of being an incredibly dispersed community. So aside from Chinatown, people have no idea how to deal with us as Asian Americans, right? We have such a diverse and dispersed community by ethnic group and by geography. Nobody knows how to reach us. And then, when we talk about working with our community-based organizations, it's so small, like the groups are so small that the government doesn't really know how to interact at that level. And so just from a broader perspective, I just wanted to share that that frustration for us, right, is that because we don't make up a majority, we're never on the list. And then within that 7% that we make up, I think there's oftentimes that misperception that there isn't need. And then when we talk about the specific needs, there isn't the willingness or ability, particularly of government, but other entities, including philanthropy. We can talk about the AAPIP report and the lack of funding to Asian American communities in general, that people don't know how to deal with us and support us, but also don't really want to try to figure it out.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think that I am curious. I appreciate you, David, sharing the vulnerability index to kind of understand how they calculate this vulnerability, right? Because I think that there are barriers that Asian American and immigrant communities experience that are not always taken into account, right? Language being one of those things. Like when there are language barriers, it becomes much, much, much more difficult to get people, to access a resource like a vaccine, or to get people to show up to an event or some distribution, right? And that there may be more investment needed in the type of outreach, right? And like that, I think, is where our community-based organizations really bring so many strengths, right? Both in terms of language access, but also just in terms of relationships in the community, that you need a certain level of trust. If somebody is a non-English speaker or a limited English speaker and is undocumented, the level of trust that they need to, take action on something is higher. And those are also things that can contribute to vulnerability, even when there are things, like familiarity with pandemics and having good masking behavior, right, that are positives. There are also, I think, it's really important to recognize some of the things that may not always be taken into account that can really increase vulnerability.
I really agree with what you're saying, Josina and Grace. And I think one of the things, so I'm Angie Lobo, Executive Director at Indo-American Center. And one of the things that happens with us a lot is people are like, oh, we want to do this program with the South Asian community. Let's call it Indo-American Center. And so we get dozens of requests a week, but no additional like capacity for it. So just yesterday, I had a meeting with someone who's like, we want to do a financial literacy program. And I was like, great, how much money are you going to give me? Because, and they're like, no, you just turn everyone out and do the translation. We bring everything. And I was like, okay, turning people out and doing the translation requires a lot of work. And that I think, so Josina, when you were saying like, we don't, you know, the bigger places don't know how to interact with the smaller groups, that dynamic starts to get, even when people want to do the outreach, they're not investing in the capacity that it takes at the community organization level. So that's really something I think we all need to do some advocacy around.
And I would add that I think there's a mentality like that they're doing us a favor. And so we should be providing the translation for free. And I've seen, you know, I think a really great example of a community that's really pushed back on that effectively is the deaf and hearing disabled community has really pushed back on like this idea that, you know, government or other entities should be providing signers for free, that they need to be paid, they need to be respected, they need to be built into the plan. And I think that that's an interesting model for us to also look about how to advocate more effectively. It's something I had to do at MWRD. You know, we have a $2 million public affairs department. We're supposed to serve all of Cook County, yet there was nobody who spoke Spanish, nobody who spoke Chinese, nobody who spoke Polish, and one African American, right? And so it has to reflect, they need to understand that it needs to be in their budget and in their capacity, not something that we go and ask, you know, small community organizations when we're a $1.2 billion organization to be doing for free. So I'm proud that we just made the commitment this month to start translating all of our materials into Chinese and build the internal capacity to do that. But that took me 4 years as a commissioner to do that in one agency. So we hear you. Suzanne, did you have a question? I thought I saw you. You're muted.
I did, thank you. I'm Suzanne Yoon. I am actually a business leader. So I run a private equity firm in Chicago. So not involved, but also very involved in my own philanthropy and just philanthropy in general. And I just wanted to share kind of just share a story, ask a question, and then also just wanted to thank everybody who's on the call, because I think this is an issue where people from, you know, not just the not-for-profit world and the political world, but the business community and leaders in the community that are on that higher end, you know, I would say in the income earning space, all need to get together to figure out how to solve this. And just the visibility or invisibility of the Asian American community in the United States. So prior to, and I think, thank you, Brandon, for all the data. That was incredible. Just and Josina, the history, because I think we see it naturally. You know, I'm first generation. I know many of you are generation here in the States, but a few weeks prior to Atlanta, I had reached out to a not-for-profit who does a lot of great work for women and really women who live in poverty. And they were really focused on specifically, you know, Black and Brown communities. And I had reached out to them because I've been a donor to that organization, and really just to bring to light that there are a lot of underserved communities, particularly in the Asian American community, that are very silent, right? I think the data and what I wouldn't say I got a very dismissive response to, you know, what about the Asian community? Because there's a lot of poverty in the Asian community. There are women who just don't speak up, right? That are subject to domestic abuse and violence, and, you know, in some cases much worse, because the culture itself, you know, is one that suppresses anything that could possibly be embarrassing to, you know, a family. So it was, so the response I got was somewhat dismissive, and really pointing to the fact that there's not enough data. What I was told is there's not enough data out there to support your concerns around the Asian American communities. And I'm like, anecdotally, although, I kind of came out of a, I would say, single parent home and, was able to kind of create my own life. Anecdotally, I saw it my whole life within the Asian American community because of language barriers and mistreatment. And so still a lot of pushback. So I'm just kind of, my question to you is not-for-profit leaders, and Josina, you too, is really, how do you respond to that? Right. I'm coming from a position of, I would say, some influence. And, how do we respond to that?
Suzanne, I really appreciate you sharing all of that with us. That's in just the personal side of it too. Thank you so much. That's incredible. I'm Bree McLuhan. I'm from the Hanul Family Alliance up in Albany Park. I'm the Development and Communications Coordinator. And one of the things that just really struck me about, like, in tandem in relationship to what happened in Atlanta with so many of our Asian American women, and what you're speaking to as far as, like, where is this data so that we could present it to our government and to our elected officials. I believe that really shortly after what happened in Atlanta, there was Daniel Day Kim testified before Congress and said, the AAPI communities in this country are considered statistically insignificant, which means that there really is no data on us, and as far as the US Census. And that really rang true with me, that was done by design, because I know that that's something that's been done by design in the indigenous communities here. It's just a total erasure of us. And so that if some kind of persecution or this clear misogynistic racism happens, we just don't exist. And so there's not really a problem if we don't exist, right? So that kind of just, when he testified, I was, being able to just connect that back to what happened in Atlanta. And I know we're sitting here talking a lot about this data. I wonder how much data we actually don't even have about us too.
It's a lot that we don't have. Like, I hope that the resources that I share, I dropped a bunch more links in the comments in case you missed them. And there, some don't have the depth that we really need. Some don't have, some might not have the ethnic group by ethnic group breakdown, right? Even if you get a number for broad Asian Americans. So there definitely are gaps, and gaps remain, right? Like, I hope that there's enough here, like, for immediate, for like right now, if you need to, like, if you have to pull something, that there are a few different places where you might be able to pull it from, but you're absolutely right. Like, both of you, Bree and Suzanne, like, there are still gaps, and there are still things info that is not collected on Asian Americans. And a lot of times it's kind of hidden behind small numbers, but really there is some intention behind not wanting to dive deep.
I think there's a data question, and this is also where, I know a lot of you are in philanthropy, is to think about how you can support, the Asian American report that Brandon worked on in UIC was really groundbreaking, because nobody had even asked who we were before, right? And that was a first step at some of kind of the, quantitative data. But I think that there's a lot of work if we really did have an intentional strategy to help build the capacity of some of our Asian American service organizations in particular to be data generators, right? They have contact with so many people that are not, normally counted, both in a quantitative way, but also a qualitative way. So I'd put on the table the idea of what the role of, philanthropy can be in helping fill some of that data gap. And I'd also just offer, like, people tell us all the time they don't have the data. But really, a lot of this is also a political will question, right? Like, you know, it's not just, they're not just resisting because they don't have the data. They're just resisting because they don't think that we're important, and because they don't want to be bothered with our complexities, you know, which are difficult, from language to ethnicity and the class disaggregations and things like that. But I think that's also where there needs to be more of a political push. And that's where, you know, we as a caucus have really been focusing on shifting the narrative. You know, I think to Suzanne's kind of thing, like, I've worked on racial equity work for a long time. I've used the Black-Brown framework, but I also always look at Asian American, American Indian, other data to see if they're also how those disparities are being impacted. And I think, you know, there are a lot of cases where Black-Brown has become the default. And there are a lot of situations where Asian Americans are sometimes even the most impacted. Like the Diversity on Corporate Boards report just came out recently, where Asian Americans were actually the least represented. Yet the headline and all of the discussion was about the lack of representation of Black and Brown, which should be on the table. But even when the data shows that Asians are the most impacted, or that Asians are impacted, the conversation does tend to generically shift to only Black and Brown. And that's where we also want to continue to push back at, you know, on, you know, where do Asian Americans, where do other smaller communities that are quantitatively inconvenient, you know, where is the push to continue to make sure that we're in the conversation, especially when the data shows that. I mean, this is a situation where we've really had to push back on people when even when the data says that Asians are the most impacted, they still don't talk about us.
Well, Josina, I just wanted to mention, I do know, because I just want to clarify with the conversation that I had, the additional, you know, I would say follow-up conversation that I had post the Atlanta shooting. So this was before the Atlanta shootings, and then there was a post. And so it just happened to be like, you know, interesting timing. But the comment was, and I agree with this, so I just want to note that what is good for the Black and Brown community is good for all minority communities, which I completely agree with. And so the demographics there are much larger, but I do think it's important that we're included in that discussion. And that's so that we're not forgotten, because I think there is what's coming to the surface is, you know, there was an article that was written, and I wish I had it because I have to leave. But there was an article written about Asian Americans. The title of it is "Asian Americans Are Looking for a Hero." And, you know, in the sub question, you know, title to the article was, and it was posted, I think, in the Washington Post, was, how did we go from being the model minority to the invisible minority to the hunted minority? Mm-hmm. And so, you know, and I think it's because we're just not in the discussion, right? So I just think, you know, banding together with other minority groups is really important. And so that even the other minority groups see us. So I think they're more likely to see us than the majority.
Yeah.
So anyway, with that, I have to leave, but thank you so much. This was amazing.
No, I think a lot of us, you know, are hitting our 12 o'clock meetings. You know, again, thank you all for joining us. I'm going to download the chat, and we'll try to send out a list of, you know, resources and responses to some of the questions and issues that were raised in the chat that we didn't get to. And hopefully, I know that there's a part 2 that Forefront and AAPIP are doing coming up. Did somebody want to announce that real quick before we close?
Yeah, thank you, Josina. Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, Grace. Thanks for everybody for being here and for sharing such amazing and helpful information. I'm Lisa. I'm with Forefront. We are hosting a part 2, and grateful to be able to co-host this and to co-host another session on the 20th. I dropped a link in the chat. Grant makers and funders are invited to continue the conversation with us. We'll have folks from the Hannah Center, from Chinese Mutual Aid Association, and from APNAGAR to talk about current community needs and how philanthropy can engage there. So looking forward to that. And again, thanks for the opportunity to co-host today.
Thank you, everybody. And I can't download the chat. Whoever has hosting capability, if you could download the chat and send that to us, that would be great. All right. Thanks, everybody.